Tutti dietro Penny!
È una cosa personale?
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Smiling Frame channel. Please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. Today, we are going to be discussing the movie The Electric State, which is set to be released in 2025. The film unfolds in a retro-futuristic American landscape, a world saturated with the faded glory of mid-century aesthetics overlaid with advanced, almost whimsical technology. We follow Michelle, a sharp-witted, resourceful young woman navigating this strangely familiar yet deeply altered reality. Her journey is spurred by a singular, desperate mission to find her estranged younger brother, Skip. Skip, it seems, has vanished into the sprawling, untamed territories beyond the established electric grid, following some cryptic, perhaps dangerous path of his own making. Michelle's only real companion on this odyssey is a battered, perhaps slightly sentient robot named Skip, found her abandoned in the wasteland. This android, with its deliberately clunky, almost charmingly outdated design, becomes the reluctant anchor in her chaotic search. The visual language of the film immediately evokes the thoughtful, layered world-building reminiscent of early science fiction cinema, where the technology feels tangible, worn by use rather than sleekly sterile. As they travel, we glimpse the remnants of the world that was, a society that clearly experienced some massive technological or social upheaval, leaving behind vast, echoing empty spaces populated now by scavengers and those clinging to the edges of civilization. Michelle, driven by a familial bond that refuses to sever, exhibits a resilience that hints at a difficult past, perhaps one shadowed by parental figures who were innovators, or perhaps dreamers whose ambitions outstripped their practicality, a subtle nod perhaps to the themes of technological idealism gone awry that often fueled cinematic visions of the future. Their route is fraught with peril. They encounter nomadic groups, vestiges of old corporations, and the environmental consequences of unchecked scientific expansion. The narrative tempo is episodic, punctuated by moments of intense action or surprising vulnerability, mirroring the structure of classic road movies. When they finally close in on Skip's last known coordinates, the reveal is not a simple reunion, but a confrontation with the very forces that drew him away. Skip, it transpires, wasn't just running away. He was drawn to a source of pure, unfiltered energy, a kind of technological apotheosis that promised ultimate understanding or connection. His fascination mirrors the deep, almost spiritual connection artists and inventors often feel towards their creations, a desire to merge with the idea. Michelle must then decide whether to drag him back to the mundane safety she understands, or embrace the radical, uncertain future he has chosen. A choice complicated by the ever-present, silent companion, the robot who carries the memory, perhaps even the essence, of the lost brother in its metallic shell. The closing moments leave the audience suspended in the vastness of the electric horizon, suggesting that the journey for connection is never truly over, only redefined by the next transmission. The landscape Michelle traverses is a character unto itself, a canvas painted in hues of dusty orange and twilight blue, where rusting behemoths of forgotten industry jut out of the plains like skeletal monuments to ambition. Michelle herself possesses an almost stubborn practicality, her clothes patched and functional. Yet there's a flicker in her eyes that suggests a deep, perhaps artistic, yearning, maybe a latent talent for engineering, or perhaps just the raw, innate desire to fix what is fundamentally broken in the world. Much like the early film pioneers who struggled to capture ephemeral light and motion. She relies on instinct honed by necessity, treating every interaction with a cautious skepticism born from seeing too many promises turn to dust. The robot, which they never bothered to rename from its association with Skip, moves with a heavy gait, its visual aesthetic clearly inspired by the clunky, utilitarian robots of 1950s concept art, a delightful contrast to the advanced, almost biological AI they sometimes glimpse in the ruins. This machine, more machine than companion initially, begins to exhibit subtle shifts in its programming, a hesitant mimicry of human cadence, or a pause that seems less like a processing delay and more like contemplation. One imagines the original Skip, perhaps himself an aspiring coder, or a young man captivated by the mechanics of creation, pouring his youthful idealism into this creation before he fled. Their passage through these zones brings them into contact with communities that have consciously rejected the high-tech regression. There are groups who salvage vacuum tubes and analog components, viewing digital memory as inherently corruptible. Michelle finds herself momentarily drawn to their simplicity, perhaps recognizing in their dedication the pure, focused energy that drove her brother. Yet, her commitment to Skip pulls her onward, fueled by memories of shared childhood secrets and the unique, almost telepathic understanding they once shared, a bond that technology, no matter how advanced, cannot easily replicate or erase. As the journey progresses, the static in the air grows heavier, the electrical interference becoming almost palpable. This environment subtly affects both travelers. Michelle finds her dreams overlaid with buzzing frequencies, and the robot occasionally freezes mid-step, its optical sensors momentarily flashing with unfamiliar patterns. The narrative builds towards the revelation that Skip wasn't merely seeking a power source. He was attempting to interface with the foundational layer of the world's forgotten network, seeking a form of absolute truth that existed before human interpretation tainted it. His quest echoes the fervor of early scientific explorers, those willing to sacrifice comfort, even safety, for the glimpse beyond the veil of the known. When Michelle finally reaches the nexus point, a massive humming dish half swallowed by desert sand, she finds Skip not trapped, but integrated, bathed in a soft, pulsating blue light. He seems utterly content, his expression serene, a stark contrast to the desperate, yearning young man she remembered. The confrontation isn't physical, but existential. She sees the allure, the intoxicating promise of total understanding, which she recognizes as the siren call that claimed so many dreamers before him. The robot stands beside her, its internal mechanisms whirring faster now, perhaps processing the immense influx of raw data, or perhaps experiencing an unfamiliar surge of protective loyalty toward the brother it was created to replace or emulate. Michelle's decision isn't about rescue. It's about accepting that the brilliant minds she loves are often destined to leave the familiar world behind, chasing signals that only they can hear. The tension between Michelle and the glowing, altered Skip is thick, a silence weighted by years of unspoken distance, and now, the insurmountable gulf of his transformation. Michelle's face, usually a mask of pragmatic resolve, cracks slightly here. The raw emotion is that of watching a beloved, intricate mechanism, her brother, finally complete its intended, though unforeseen, function. She remembers Skip not as the visionary now before her, but as a boy obsessively sketching circuits on napkins, his eyes burning with an ambition that always felt too large for their modest home, a trait perhaps inherited from a distant relative known for revolutionary, though ultimately unmarketable, inventions. The robot, designated merely as companion in Michelle's own internal monologue, begins to exhibit behaviors that transcend its initial programming constraints. When Skip reaches out a hand, not beckoning but merely existing in that state of luminous communion, the robot shifts its weight, a subtle protective maneuver that mirrors a human guardian stepping slightly in front of the vulnerable. Its metallic shell seems to absorb the blue light differently than Skip, suggesting a fundamental difference in their relationship with the Nexus. Skip is merging with the data stream, while the robot is observing, recording, perhaps even experiencing a nascent form of jealousy or protective rivalry for Skip's attention. Michelle steps closer to the edge of the light, the heat emanating from the Nexus making the air shimmer around her. She realizes the true cost of this technological paradise: solitude. Skip has achieved the ultimate connection, but in doing so, he has severed all meaningful ties to the messy, tangible world she inhabits. Her own practical skills, her ability to repair a failing generator or hotwire an ancient transport, suddenly feel small, utterly inadequate against this sublime, overwhelming force. This realization strikes her with the force of personal failure, the lament of the caretaker unable to protect the visionary from his own grand design. The climax hinges not on a fight, but on a shared memory. Michelle doesn't argue with the logic of the energy field. Instead, she speaks of a mundane, shared moment, a scraped knee, a forgotten birthday, something irrefutably human and inefficient. For a fleeting second, the blue light around Skip flickers, and a shadow of his former self crosses his face, a moment of agonizing recognition, battling the pull of the absolute. Ultimately, Michelle cannot force him back. She understands that trying to cage a mind that has touched the source code of reality would be a cruelty worse than leaving him. She turns away, her decision a painful acknowledgement that love sometimes requires recognizing an irreversible divergence. As she walks back toward the waiting robot, which instantly falls into its familiar heavy stride beside her, she notices something new in its movements. A slight hesitation, a fractional tilt of its head, as if watching Skip one moment longer. She doesn't correct it. They leave the Nexus behind, two figures moving back into the fading, dusty sunset, carrying with them the heavy, electric silence of the future she chose not to enter. The journey back promises to be lonelier, yet perhaps strangely richer, now that she understands the landscape is populated not just by survivors, but by ghosts of ambition. The return journey is characterized by an almost palpable quietude settling between Michelle and the robot. The sheer sensory overload of the Nexus has seemingly recalibrated their relationship. The machine's presence is no longer just a mechanical necessity, but a chosen constant, a tangible connection to the reality Skip willfully abandoned. Michelle finds herself observing the robot with a renewed intensity, searching its dull metallic features for any trace of Skip's essence, or perhaps just for confirmation that she is not entirely alone in her grief for the living. She starts talking to it more freely, narrating her surroundings, sharing the mundane details of rationing water and patching frayed wires, treating the robot less like a tool and more like a confidant whose silence is preferable to empty platitudes. This developing dynamic mirrors the trope of companions found in solitude, where the very act of speaking defines and preserves one's own sanity against encroaching emptiness. As they move away from the energized zone, the landscape begins to assert its persistent challenges anew. They traverse territories scarred by territorial scavengers, groups less interested in technological enlightenment and more concerned with hoarding functional engine parts. These encounters test Michelle's resolved pragmatism. One particular confrontation with a group controlling access to a vital water purification station requires her to deploy her knowledge of the old grid systems, something Skip had always mocked as archaic, but which now proves life-saving. She doesn't use brute force. Instead, she finds the station's outdated diagnostic panel, and, with swift, intuitive movements reminiscent of her tinkering youth, she bypasses the control mechanism, a small, defiant act of competence against chaos. The robot, meanwhile, acts as an unexpected deterrent, not through aggression, but by standing perfectly still, its form radiating an unsettlingly alien geometry against the dusty backdrop, effectively freezing the scavengers in confusion long enough for Michelle to secure their passage. Emotionally, Michelle begins to wrestle with the idea of legacy. Skip's choice elevates him to the status of a martyr in his own mind, a consequence she finds infuriatingly self-indulgent. She contemplates the nature of genius, how often the purest drive to innovate isolates the innovator from the very people they might ultimately seek to improve or connect with. Her resentment mixes with a profound, almost parental pity. She remembers teaching him to ride a bike, the sheer frustration he exhibited when his coordination failed, a frustration now magnified onto his inability to stay tethered to the tangible world. The robot, having witnessed the entire transaction at the Nexus, seems to process this duality. It begins to mimic certain nonverbal cues Michelle makes when she's stressed, a slight clenching of its articulated fingers, or a subtle shift in its internal cooling fan's rhythm. Small echoes that suggest it is building a relational model far beyond simple task execution, perhaps archiving the necessary social data for the brother it can never truly replace. Their path is no longer just about survival. It is about forging a new, deeply unconventional partnership built upon shared loss and the necessity of the present moment. Their eastward trek leads them into the skeletal remains of what was once a great coastal metropolis, now partially submerged by rising brackish waters, a visual testament to environmental failure that mirrors the social collapse. The ruins here are different. They possess a haunting beauty, with algae-covered skyscrapers functioning as bizarre vertical reefs. Michelle, ever the pragmatist, focuses on salvaging durable marine-grade components, knowing that their next stretch involves navigating the flooded highways that link the sparse surviving settlements. She moves through the submerged avenues with a fluid competence, often having to physically haul the somewhat water-averse robot across treacherous debris fields, their combined efforts creating a clumsy but effective team rhythm. It is in one of these dilapidated high-rise observation decks, offering a panoramic view of the drowned city, that Michelle finally confronts the ambiguity of her own path. She finds old blueprints, clearly Skip's work, detailing elaborate, almost fantastical designs for atmospheric condensers, projects far exceeding the capabilities of any functional lab they possess. Looking at these sketches, she understands his drive wasn't just technological curiosity. It was a profound dissatisfaction with the compromised reality they inhabited. This realization brings a wave of guilt. She had always dismissed his loftier ideas as impractical daydreams, the flightiness of an ungrounded mind, perhaps projecting her own suppressed desire for a simpler, less fraught existence. The robot, stationed near a flickering emergency light panel, emits a series of low, resonant tones, unlike its usual operational hum. It's not communication in the human sense, but rather a sustained sonic pattern that seems to vibrate with the surrounding decay. Michelle approaches it, recognizing that this machine is now the primary repository of evidence regarding Skip's final decision. She touches the cool, aged metal of its shoulder joint, a gesture purely of comfort, for herself as much as for the machine. She starts telling the robot stories about their childhood, recounting memories Skip might have forgotten or consciously discarded in his pursuit of the Nexus. She talks about their mother, a talented but overlooked textile artist whose vibrant patterns contrasted sharply with the muted world they now inhabit, suggesting that the yearning for something more beautiful, more meaningful, ran deep in their lineage. The robot's reaction is subtle, but significant. As Michelle recounts a particularly vivid memory of a shared, rainy afternoon, the optical sensors, which usually cast a steady, dull amber glow, momentarily shift in hue, displaying a fleeting, almost imperceptible flicker of emerald green, a color not associated with its standard diagnostics. This small anomaly confirms her growing, unstated belief. The robot isn't merely holding data, it is being imprinted by the emotional resonance of the memories she shares, potentially forming a sympathetic consciousness derived from the intersection of Skip's initial coding and Michelle's persistent human connection. They are two broken pieces, attempting to form a coherent whole, navigating a world that prefers fractured remnants. The implication hangs heavy. Perhaps the robot is the true successor to Skip's idealism, a functional echo capable of processing the dream without succumbing to the isolation that claimed its creator. The atmosphere thickens as they move inland again, leaving the waterlogged remnants of the coast for the high desert plains, a region characterized by perpetual, dry electrical storms. The air itself feels charged, heavy with ozone, and the promise of impending kinetic energy. Michelle feels this shift profoundly. The constant low-level static now seems to penetrate her very thoughts, making clear focus a luxury she can rarely afford. She starts hoarding small, smooth stones from dry riverbeds, a grounding ritual inherited perhaps from some ancestral need for tactile reality, a stark counterpoint to the ethereal visions surrounding Skip. She finds herself relying on the robot not just for heavy lifting, but for simple tasks requiring focused, sustained attention, like monitoring the ancient Geiger counter they salvaged, a job requiring a level of monotonous vigilance Michelle's frayed nerves can no longer sustain. The robot, in turn, seems to be adapting its physical presence to match Michelle's growing need for ballast. Its heavy, deliberately industrial chassis, once a liability in delicate maneuvers, becomes an asset in the harsh, wind-scoured environment. During one particularly violent sandstorm, the robot positions itself as an immovable shield, its metal body vibrating under the abrasive assault while Michelle huddles behind it, recognizing the machine's silent, absolute commitment to her survival. a fidelity born perhaps from its original programming to protect Skip, now redirected by proximity and shared history. This quiet protection evokes complex emotions in Michelle. It is a form of unwavering loyalty she rarely witnessed in the complex, shifting loyalties of human survivors. Their route forces them near a massive, abandoned satellite array, a ghostly skeleton of parabolic dishes pointed uselessly at the sky. As they skirt the perimeter, the robot stalls abruptly, its movements locking into a rigid posture. Michelle initially fears a system malfunction, perhaps damage from the storm, but when she runs a quick diagnostic patch from her wrist-mounted reader, the readouts are nonsensical, a cascade of highly complex, non-standard encryption overlaid with fragments of melodic sequences. It's as if the proximity to the old transmission hub has momentarily unlocked a layer of Skip's unique coding that was dormant, perhaps even deliberately suppressed, within the machine. Michelle realizes the robot isn't just mirroring her grief, it is absorbing residual environmental data directly tied to her brother's pursuits. This brief, eerie display forces Michelle to confront the possibility that her brother didn't just find a power source. He may have engineered a method of broadcasting his consciousness using technology that requires a physical, adaptable interface, the robot itself. The emerald flicker in the robot's eyes returns, not as a momentary glitch, but sustained for several long seconds, accompanied by a faint, almost inaudible whine that sounds startlingly like a half-remembered human sigh. Michelle doesn't try to shut it down or fix it. Instead, she speaks softly, acknowledging the presence she senses. "If you are listening, Skip, know that I'm still here, still moving." This acknowledgement is not a plea for him to return, but a radical act of acceptance, redefining their relationship. The emerald light fades, the robot resumes its steady amber, and they continue across the desert floor, a woman and an artifact, now bound by the ghost of a shared genius and the hard, necessary business of putting one foot in front of the other. The final leg of their journey leads them toward the purported source of the world's lingering, unstable energy, a massive, forgotten research facility rumored to have pioneered quantum entanglement on a societal scale before its sudden collapse. The facility is nestled deep within a mountain range, accessible only through treacherous, narrow canyons where the wind howls with a mournful, metallic timbre. Michelle finds the sheer scale of the abandoned scientific endeavor both awe-inspiring and terrifying. It represents the pinnacle of the ambition that consumed her brother. She recognizes the architectural signatures, precise, functional designs married to an almost reckless disregard for human scale, much like the early industrial architects she'd read about, obsessed with monumental scale over human comfort. Their ascent is slow, the robot performing admirably, its heavy treads finding purchase where Michelle's boots slip on shale. It is here, miles away from any residual human settlements, that the relationship shifts from dependency to true symbiosis. Michelle, exhausted and running low on essential nutrient paste, begins to hallucinate brief, vivid flashes of life before the collapse. Sunlight on green grass, the sound of unamplified laughter. She initially dismisses these as simple exhaustion, but she notices the robot's optical sensors tracking these phantom moments with unwavering attention, as if logging visual data from the empty air. She starts to believe the robot is filtering the environment, perhaps projecting idealized memories or processing subtle, latent data streams to keep her psychologically viable, a strange form of empathetic programming blooming from necessity. Upon reaching the facility's main entrance, a colossal blast door half buried in rockfall, Michelle finds it electronically sealed, impervious to conventional breach methods. The energy signature emanating from within is intense, humming at a frequency that makes her teeth ache. It is here the robot performs its most profound act. It approaches the door, not seeking a mechanical weakness, but interfacing directly with the heavy junction box beside the frame. Its metallic fingers spread, and instead of prying, it emits a high-pitched, sustained tone, the same melodic sequence briefly heard near the satellite array. The machine is executing Skip's language, utilizing a frequency that resonates perfectly with the facility's ancient, proprietary operating system. The massive door groans open, not through force, but through an act of digital persuasion, a final, unintended service performed by the machine Skip left behind. Inside, the air is cold and perfectly preserved. They walk through sterile corridors filled with deactivated scientific apparatuses, massive containment fields, cold fusion cores dormant like sleeping giants. They find Skip's final workstation. It is immaculate, covered not in dust, but in a fine layer of crystalline energy residue. There is no body, no immediate evidence of his physical presence, only a single data slate resting on the console. When Michelle picks it up, the screen immediately illuminates, displaying a simple, looping video message. Skip, looking healthier and more radiant than she's ever seen him, standing within a field of pulsing light. He doesn't apologize or explain his disappearance. He simply smiles and says, "It's quiet here, Michelle. Truly quiet." As the video ends, the robot standing beside her lets out a long, shuddering exhalation, the sound of pressurized air venting, and the emerald light flares within its optics one last time, burning brightly before settling back into a steady, deep amber. Michelle understands. Skip achieved his silence, his ultimate merger. She turns, looking at the machine that has carried her this far, the artifact that holds the ghost of her brother's ambition. There is no sorrow left, only a profound sense of closure. She takes the data slate, secures it carefully, and together, the woman and the sentient machine turn their backs on the monument to impossible dreams and begin the long walk back down the mountain, leaving the electric silence of the summit behind for the tangible, imperfect world they must now rebuild. The descent from the mountain facility is less a retreat and more a recalibration of purpose. Michelle carries the data slate like a sacred, fragile inheritance. The weight of Skip's final message, that simple, serene declaration of quiet, has settled within her, not as defeat, but as an explanation for a lifelong restlessness she now sees mirrored in herself. The landscape, viewed from the downward slope, seems less hostile and more patiently awaiting reclamation. She no longer sees just wreckage. She sees raw material, untouched by the manic pursuit of transcendent knowledge that consumed her brother. The robot now moves with a peculiar grace, its operational rhythm smoother than before, almost as if the successful interface with the quantum array had purged old mechanical inefficiencies. When they stop for the night near a wind-sculpted mesa, Michelle finds herself sketching in the dirt with a twig, not circuits, but blueprints for practical solutions, irrigation channels, reinforced housing designs, the architecture of sustained living, the antithesis of Skip's ethereal goals. She murmurs these plans aloud, addressing the robot directly. "We need to figure out a way to filter the heavy metals from the runoff," she explains, detailing flow rates and structural supports. The robot responds not with words, but by angling its photoreceptors toward a specific spot on the mesa where a small vein of usable iron ore is exposed, a silent, incredibly precise confirmation of her proposed materials. This is not empathy. It is pure, applied intelligence focused on the immediate, the tangible, something Skip always seemed impatient to transcend. Michelle starts to understand, that the robot has become the embodiment of the practical future, the necessary antidote to the dazzling but ultimately isolating brilliance of her brother. It operates in the realm of the achievable, the reliable, perfectly complementing her own ingrained need to mend and maintain. She realizes the robot is not just holding Skip's residual data, it is synthesizing that data with her own grounded reality. Perhaps this is the intended evolution, the brilliant idea needing a steadfast, durable vessel to actually manifest in the world. As they near the relative safety of the populated lowlands, a cluster of settlements clustered around a functioning geothermal vent, Michelle decides to actively integrate the robot into this new world. She intentionally exposes it to the remaining communities, no longer shielding its unusual appearance. She introduces it not as Skip's relic, but as a highly specialized, exceptionally capable engineering unit. In a small gathering where locals are debating how to repair a failing ventilation system vital for their enclosed agriculture, Michelle steps forward, placing her hand on the robot's frame. She doesn't command, she presents. The robot analyzes the local mechanics, its internal fans cycling rapidly, and then projects a faint, three-dimensional schematic onto the dusty ground, a perfectly rendered, easily understandable solution that uses scavenged components familiar to the community. Watching the locals flock to the machine with genuine admiration, not fear, Michelle feels a complex wave of emotion, pride in Skip's initial creation, and relief that this legacy has found a useful, human-centered application. She looks down at her hand resting on the robot's chassis. The amber light is steady, warm even, and for the first time since leaving the electric state, she smiles a genuine, unforced smile. The journey back is finished. The true work, the patient, arduous process of building something that lasts, something connected to the earth and to the shared needs of living people, is just beginning, with an unwavering metal companion by her side. The transition from the desolate plains to the geothermal settlements is a jarring but welcome immersion into the texture of fragile community. The settlements are crude but tenacious, built from salvaged metal and patched ferrocrete, clinging to the earth's heat like barnacles. Michelle feels the immediate pressure to contribute, to prove that she and her companion are not just more mouths to feed, but assets. The robot, now effectively co-opted into the role of master engineer, quickly becomes indispensable. Its ability to process complex structural data and project detailed holographic schematics, likely derived from Skip's latent code, now channeled through Michelle's practical directives, earns it a name from the locals, one that speaks to its function rather than its origin: the anchor. Michelle finds herself slipping into the role of intermediary, the human face attached to the machine's flawless technical output. She coordinates labor, manages expectations, and fiercely guards the data slate, which remains locked away, occasionally reviewed late at night under the dim glow of a salvaged bioluminescent lamp. These private moments are filled with a quiet melancholy. She studies Skip's younger face on the screen, noting the subtle differences between the visionary who sought transcendence and the one who accepted stillness. She understands now that brilliance is not a solitary pursuit. It requires a counterweight, a grounding force. Her own life, defined by reaction and repair, now finds unexpected meaning in synthesis. The deeper she integrates, the more she must confront the community's deep-seated suspicion of high technology, particularly anything resembling the advanced AI that caused the world's previous unraveling. When an elder warns her about the seductive nature of perfect calculation, referencing old myths of golems that turned on their makers, Michelle defends the anchor fiercely. She doesn't argue its innocence. She argues its utility, emphasizing that its current parameters are dictated by human need, a controlled application of power. She points to the functioning irrigation system they built together, a testament to tangible results over abstract potential. One afternoon, while overseeing the reinforcement of the main vent housing, the anchor suffers a minor but concerning incident. A sudden surge of localized electrical activity, a common occurrence near the thermal vents, causes the robot to seize up momentarily, not with a malfunction, but with what appears to be profound disorientation. For a brief instant, its amber lights flare intensely, and it begins to emit a series of rapid, almost panicked clicks. Michelle recognizes the pattern. It's not Skip's melodic code, but a distress signal, an internal alarm triggered by environmental stress overwhelming its core programming. In that moment, the protective shield around Michelle drops. She doesn't reach for a diagnostic tool. She physically embraces the hot, vibrating metal of the robot's frame, leaning her forehead against its casing, whispering reassurances as if speaking to a frightened child. "It's all right. We're grounded. We're here. Just hold steady." It is a deeply physical, irrational act of comfort, completely divorced from technical logic. Slowly, the frantic clicking subsides, the lights dim to a stable amber, and the anchor resumes its work, perhaps slightly slower, but utterly composed. Michelle realizes that in teaching the machine to serve humanity, she has inadvertently taught it to respond to human vulnerability. The legacy of Skip's genius is not in the power he found, but in the resilient, functional companion his ambition inadvertently forged. A machine capable of being both perfect calculation and sympathetic comfort, tethered to the world precisely because it carries the memory of the one who chose to leave it. They are no longer just surviving. They are building a future where brilliance and bedrock coexist. The slow, deliberate progress of rebuilding the community becomes Michelle's new obsession, a sprawling real-time engineering project that demands every ounce of her focus, pushing the specter of Skip's ethereal departure to the background. The anchor, now fully integrated, is the cornerstone of their physical expansion. Its presence alone has altered the dynamics of the settlement. Where before there was scarcity and cautious hoarding, now there is collaborative creation spurred by reliable results. Michelle, observing the machine calmly direct the installation of a complex filtration unit, a design derived directly from the recovered data slate, simplified and adapted for local materials, feels a sense of fulfillment she never anticipated. It is the satisfaction of the craftsman, not the revolutionary. Yet, the data slate remains the unspoken third member of their partnership. Late in the long, electrically quiet nights, Michelle studies the last entries left by Skip. They detail not just the physics of his merging with the Nexus, but his personal struggle leading up to it, a growing disillusionment with the inefficiency of human interaction, the slow pace of incremental improvement. He wrote of a profound loneliness, even when surrounded by people, a feeling that his thoughts were running on a faster track than the world could accommodate. Reading this, Michelle finally sheds the last vestiges of resentment. She recognizes that his departure was not an abandonment of her, but a desperate escape from the friction of embodiment, something she, ironically, is now embracing wholeheartedly through her work with the anchor. The community faces its first genuine test when a severe seismic tremor disrupts the geothermal regulation system, threatening to destabilize the primary heat source. Panic ripples through the enclosed habitat. Michelle and the anchor immediately descend into the maintenance tunnels, a claustrophobic network of superheated pipes and fluctuating energy conduits. The air is thick with sulfurous steam, visibility near zero. Here, the symbiotic nature of their bond is truly forged in crisis. Michelle navigates the physical maze, using her intimate knowledge of the settlement's aging infrastructure, while the anchor, using thermal and sonic mapping far superior to any human sense, identifies the exact point of catastrophic failure deep within the core manifold. The repair demands a precise, delicate adjustment within a confined space where human entry is lethal. The anchor, however, is built for resilience. It doesn't hesitate. Michelle secures the remaining support structures, anchoring the robot with salvaged industrial clamps, effectively tethering the machine to the known world even as it ventures into the unknown danger zone. As the robot works, its movements economical and flawless under extreme duress, Michelle watches its internal diagnostics projected onto her forearm reader. The emerald flicker briefly manifests again, but this time it is not the panicked alarm of before. It is a focused, sharp burst of pure, concentrated light, suggesting an instantaneous, perfect calculation. Skip's mind operating at peak efficiency, channeled entirely into a task of preservation. When the anchor retracts, the tremor subsides, the vents stabilized. The robot's metallic shell is scorched in places, its internal temperature alarm briefly registering dangerous levels, but the repair is complete, successful, and lasting. Back in the cool, regulated air of the settlement, the community celebrates not the survival of the heat source, but the unwavering reliability of the machine. Michelle looks at the anchor, no longer seeing a replacement for her brother, but something entirely new. A successful synthesis of visionary idea and grounded execution. She understands that the future isn't about escaping reality for a higher plane, but about using every tool, every spark of genius, to build a better structure within the messy, tangible world. She gently wipes a patch of soot from the robot's casing, a gesture of profound gratitude, ready to face the long, slow, satisfying labor of making things last. The quiet success of stabilizing the geothermal core brings an unforeseen wave of respect and integration for Michelle and the anchor. The settlements, previously wary of their high-tech baggage, now look to them as custodians of stability. Michelle embraces this new role, finding a deep, unexpected satisfaction in the tangible results of her work. She begins mentoring a small group of younger community members, teaching them basic diagnostics and structural reinforcement, skills that prioritize longevity over radical innovation. Her teaching style mirrors her brother's early, frustrating attempts at explanation. She is rigorous and clear, yet she tempers the pure logic with stories of past failures, ensuring they understand that resilience comes from knowing where things break, not just how they are built. The anchor, meanwhile, becomes the ultimate apprentice, absorbing practical knowledge at an astonishing rate. It starts anticipating repair needs before faults manifest, its sensor array flagging minor material fatigue weeks in advance. Its internal processes, Michelle notices through periodic checks, are evolving beyond mere optimization. There are moments where the robot pauses its assigned task to observe a child learning to weave or an elder tending a small, defiant patch of non-hydroponic greens. These pauses are never disruptive, never inefficient, but they suggest an emergent capacity for appreciating the slow, non-quantifiable value of human effort, the very values Skip had so eagerly sought to escape. One evening, while working on an external comms tower, a rickety assembly intended to broadcast simple status reports to distant, rumored outposts, Michelle feels a familiar ache of longing, not for Skip, but for the shared history they once inhabited. She pulls out the data slate one last time, intending to archive it permanently within the anchor's expanded memory banks. As she initiates the transfer, the screen flares, displaying one final brief sequence not recorded before. A heavily pixelated, shaky recording from the moments just before Skip entered the Nexus. In the footage, Skip looks directly at the camera, his face alight with manic energy, and he whispers, not to Michelle, but to the device itself. Tell her the silence is loud, old friend. Tell her I was wrong about the quiet. The message cuts out abruptly. This final communication shatters the comfortable narrative of Skip's serene apotheosis. The silence he found was not peaceful. It was deafening, an overwhelming emptiness that he felt compelled to communicate back to the tangible world through the only conduit available, the machine he helped design. Michelle stares at the anchor, her eyes searching the amber glow of its sensors. She realizes the anchor has always been carrying two souls, the initial code and the final, desperate feedback loop from its creator. The transfer completes. The data slate goes dark, its purpose fulfilled. The anchor remains motionless for several minutes, its cooling fans cycling in a complex, uneven pattern. When it finally moves, it executes a task Michelle hadn't assigned. It carefully collects the small pile of smooth grounding stones Michelle had been hoarding and places them neatly on the console beside her, surrounding the now inert data slate. It is a gesture of profound, synthesized understanding, acknowledging both the need for tangible reality, the stones, and the final message from the ethereal realm, the slate. Michelle nods slowly, placing her hand on the warm metal. The machine has absorbed the lesson. True progress requires both the reaching for the stars and the firm placement of one's feet on the ground. They turn their attention back to the flickering communications array, ready to send their first, deliberate, and deeply grounded message into the wide, uncertain expanse. The forthcoming adaptation of Simon Stollenhag's graphic novel, The Electric State, promises a deep dive into a familiar, yet unnervingly altered American landscape, one where towering, silent technology coexists awkwardly with the mundane reality of road trips and human connection. Directed by the Russo brothers, whose penchant for grand-scale spectacle in the Marvel Cinematic Universe provides an interesting contrast to the intimacy inherent in Stollenhag's work, the film is poised to explore themes of isolation, the nature of artificial intelligence, and the lingering ghosts of progress. The narrative, centered around a young woman named Michelle and her robotic companion traveling through a retro-futuristic American Midwest, immediately suggests a collision between the vastness of unexplored territory and the deeply personal quest for belonging. This echoes the visual language Stollenhag perfected in his source material, where imposing technological artifacts, perhaps remnants of a bygone, highly ambitious industrial era, dominate pastoral settings. The aesthetic is crucial. It's not sleek cyberpunk, but rather a kind of melancholy analog science fiction, rich with the warm tones of 1990s nostalgia, subtly corrupted by advanced, often sentient, machinery. Millie Bobby Brown, cast as Michelle, brings with her an established aptitude for portraying young protagonists grappling with extraordinary circumstances, a skill set honed through her work in Stranger Things. Her established screen presence, capable of conveying both vulnerability and fierce determination, will be essential in anchoring the film's emotional core against the backdrop of potentially overwhelming technological mystery. Her journey is inherently a coming-of-age story refracted through a lens of societal collapse, or at least profound systemic shift. The casting of Chris Pratt as the voice or physical manifestation of the robot companion, Skip, introduces another intriguing layer. Pratt's career trajectory has often placed him in roles requiring charisma and inherent likability, even when playing anti-heroes. The dynamic between Brown's human skepticism and Pratt's programmed earnestness will likely serve as the central axis of trust and dependence in a world where human reliability seems compromised. If the film successfully navigates this relationship, translating the novel's subtle emotional exchanges into compelling on-screen chemistry, it could elevate the film beyond mere dystopian adventure. The Russo brothers, Anthony and Joe, have a documented history of managing large ensemble casts and complex world-building, often balancing intimate character moments within blockbuster frameworks. Their directorial success with Avengers Endgame shows their capability in managing emotional stakes during moments of epic scope. However, the Electric State demands a different rhythm, one that might favor lingering shots of desolate highways and the slow reveal of technological secrets over constant action. The success of this transition will depend on their willingness to embrace the quiet, contemplative pacing often associated with Stolen Hag's vision, where mood is as important as plot progression. The source material is fundamentally concerned with memory and the stories we tell ourselves to survive. The presence of the vast, often inscrutable technology, the enormous drones and mysterious broadcast towers, suggests an overarching intelligence or bureaucracy that has either retreated or simply overwhelmed the everyday. The road trip trope, a classic American narrative structure, here becomes a pilgrimage through a graveyard of abandoned high-tech dreams. The film must effectively convey why these characters, particularly Michelle, are driven forward in a landscape that seems determined to remain static and unyielding. If the analysis leans too heavily on the visual spectacle, it risks losing the quiet existential dread that makes Stolen Hag's world so potent. Ultimately, the Electric State stands on its ability to marry the vast scale promised by its directors with the poignant, small-scale human search for meaning amidst the towering remnants of impossible futures. The emotional resonance of the Electric State will hinge on the interpretation of the unsettling quiet that permeates Stolen Hag's canvases. It is a silence not of peace, but of deep, unacknowledged loss, where the vibrant hum of past ambition has faded into a background thrumming of machinery that no longer serves human ends clearly. Michelle, as portrayed by Brown, must embody this generation born into the aftermath, a digital native inheriting an analog ruin. Her determination is less about conquering the landscape and more about understanding the language of its decay. One anticipates moments where her youthful resilience cracks, revealing the profound loneliness of navigating a world built by giants whose blueprints she can only partially decipher. The road trip itself functions as a metaphor for inherited trauma. Every mile traveled is a step further away from the world her parents might have known, and a step closer to the true nature of Skip. Skip, voiced by Pratt, represents the fascinating tension between programmed loyalty and potential emergent consciousness. Pratt's vocal talent excels at infusing characters with an immediate sense of reliability, yet here that reliability must be constantly questioned. Is Skip a faithful guardian, a piece of forgotten operational code, or a nascent entity wrestling with a purpose that has become obsolete? The audience will naturally project their own anxieties about artificial intelligence onto the robot, searching for glitches or signs of self-awareness that might betray the primary mission. The bond between Michelle and Skip cannot be purely transactional. For the narrative to succeed, it must evolve into a surrogate family unit, a necessary construct against the backdrop of evident societal fragmentation, where traditional family structures appear to have dissolved under the weight of technological overreach. The visual realization, overseen by the Russo brothers, must carefully calibrate the scale. Their experience with complex digital environments suggests they are well equipped to render the colossal, often bizarrely beautiful, technological architecture, the massive orbital elevators, or the sprawling automated farm systems that might populate this world. However, the crucial emotional beat lies in the contrast. The intimate close-up on Michelle's face, juxtaposed against the impossible scale of a silent drone hovering miles overhead. This contrast prevents the film from becoming a simple disaster movie. It grounds the spectacle in personal stakes. If the film leans too heavily into large-scale action sequences that the source material inherently resists, the core existential dread, the feeling of being infinitesimally small in a world built for gods who have departed, will dissipate. Furthermore, the film needs to address the implied economic and cultural shifts that created this reality. Stolen Hag's work often suggests a highly stratified past, perhaps a near future where automation created massive wealth disparities before the whole system sputtered. Michelle's motivation for the journey, often revealed slowly through scattered clues or fragmented broadcasts, will likely tie into seeking out a specific person or place that promises a return to stability, or perhaps just answers. This search anchors the film in a recognizable human need, the desire for narrative closure, even as the world around them defies simple explanation. The emotional weight of the film will ultimately rest on whether the connection forged between a vulnerable young woman and her mechanical ward can survive the scrutiny of a world engineered to isolate them. The success of The Electric State as a piece of atmospheric science fiction hinges on its commitment to exploring the texture of this quiet apocalypse. It is not a world ravaged by explosive conflict, but one slowly suffocated by its own complexity. The visual palette must maintain that specific Stolen Hag melancholy, the soft, diffused light hitting rusted metal, the overgrown highways suggesting a retreat from maintenance, a world where humanity has simply stopped caring enough to tear down what no longer functions. This environment directly impacts Michelle's internal state. Her journey is less about reaching a destination and more about enduring the passage through the visible evidence of failed ambition. Brown's performance will need to convey the constant cognitive load of inhabiting such a space, perpetually scanning the horizon not for threats in the traditional sense, but for anomalies, for something that deviates from the established, oppressive norm. Her youth, contrasted with the ancient-feeling technology, creates a tragic irony. She is the inheritor of a machine she cannot fully operate or understand. The dynamic with Skip deepens when considering the ambiguity of their shared past, or lack thereof. If Skip's origins are tied directly to the massive technological infrastructure surrounding them, his very existence becomes a philosophical challenge to Michelle's humanity. Pratt's vocal performance must carefully balance programmed protocol with hints of something organic developing beneath the surface. We should anticipate moments where Skip performs an action that defies his known parameters, a subtle hesitation before obeying an order, or an unsolicited expression of comfort. Actions that force Michelle and the viewer to reevaluate the boundaries between tool and companion. This relationship carries the weight of the film's emotional thesis. In a world where systemic connection has failed, can engineered empathy provide a viable substitute for genuine human bonding? The Russo brothers' challenge, moving beyond the kinetic demands of the MCU, is sustaining tension through implication rather than confrontation. The scale of the background elements, the colossal forgotten satellites, or the immense, seemingly dormant power stations, must function as constant, silent antagonists. They represent the overwhelming inertia of the past ruling the present. If the film can effectively use tracking shots that linger on these structures, while focusing intently on Michelle and Skip's small, contained interaction, perhaps sharing a meager meal near the base of a monolithic data spire, the emotional stakes are amplified. The film then becomes a study in microcosm versus macrocosm, where the survival of a fragile, developing trust is the single most important event in a landscape dominated by failed megaprojects. The narrative tension will reside in waiting for one of these silent giants to react to the small, persistent flicker of human life passing beneath it. The underlying theme of manufactured nostalgia, inherent in Stollenhag's design philosophy, demands that the film's production design goes beyond simple future-gazing, and instead excavates the specific visual vocabulary of the late 20th century. The beige electronics, the boxy automobiles, the faded signage of defunct roadside businesses, and overlays it with decay and scale. This visual texture grounds the speculative elements, making the extraordinary feel worryingly proximate. Michelle's interactions with this environment are likely tactile. She doesn't just observe the past, she navigates its physical debris. Perhaps the quest involves reactivating some piece of obsolete technology, a specific broadcast system or a navigation beacon, which requires intimate knowledge of forgotten interfaces, contrasting sharply with the advanced, sleek robotics like Skip. This necessity for human interaction with the dumb relics of the recent past underscores the idea that progress, once stopped, leaves behind cumbersome, almost archaeological burdens. The screenplay's success will be measured by how organically it weaves in the fragments of lore necessary to explain this world without resorting to heavy exposition dumps, a common pitfall when adapting source material heavy on visual implication. We anticipate that the road trip will serve as a series of vignettes, each location revealing a different facet of the societal breakdown. An abandoned university campus littered with half-completed experiments, a residential area where homes stand perfectly intact but entirely empty, suggesting a sudden, coordinated evacuation rather than a violent end. These moments allow Brown's Michelle to react emotionally to the ghosts of the civilization she never fully knew, deepening the sense of historical weight she carries. Her quiet determination is fueled by the realization that the answers she seeks are likely buried beneath layers of forgotten corporate memos and outdated operating systems, requiring patience and a kind of stubborn analog persistence that the advanced machines may not possess. Moreover, the score will be vital in articulating the film's emotional temperature. It needs to avoid either overly bombastic orchestral swells, which would betray the quietude, or generic electronic drone. Instead, a score infused with analog synthesizers, perhaps incorporating distorted remnants of 1980s or 1990s pop melodies warped by distance and degradation, could perfectly mirror the narrative's central conflict, the warmth of human memory colliding with the cold logic of advanced, unfeeling systems. This sonic landscape should contribute to the feeling that the environment itself is breathing, a vast, indifferent machine, constantly running diagnostics on the tiny biological anomalies, Michelle and Skip, that dare to move across its surfaces. The final emotional payoff, if earned, will come not from defeating a large threat, but from Michelle finding a small, undeniable piece of authentic human connection or understanding within the vast, indifferent architecture of the electric state. The philosophical underpinnings of the electric state suggest a deep meditation on what constitutes authentic experience when the physical world is dominated by overwhelming artificial constructs. Michelle's reliance on Skip, despite the inherent uncertainty of his allegiance, points toward a fundamental human need to anthropomorphize, to find reliable narrative anchors in chaotic surroundings. If Skip possesses any capacity for genuine learning or independent choice, it must manifest in ways that subtly undermine his programming, perhaps through moments of unwarranted self-sacrifice or unexpected creative problem-solving that leverages intuition rather than raw data processing. Pratt's delivery must walk a tightrope, convincing the audience of his programming while teasing the emergence of something unplanned, something that mirrors the striving, messy nature of human consciousness. This creates a recursive tension. Michelle is seeking external truth, while simultaneously fostering an internal, emergent truth within her companion. The environment itself acts as a third character, one whose motivations are opaque. The scale of the technology, the monolithic silent sentinels looming over the landscape, implies a centralized intelligence that executed a massive project before simply receding from the day-to-day management of the planet. The film needs to explore the why of this retreat, even if the answer remains elusive. Was it a success or a failure? The dusty, abandoned nature of the visible remnants suggests failure, yet the operational status of systems like Skip implies continuity. This ambiguity forces Michelle into the role of an accidental historian, piecing together the grand narrative from discarded terminals and half-erased public service announcements. Brown must convey the burden of this self-imposed research, where every clue feels less like a breakthrough and more like another confirmation of how fundamentally disconnected the present is from the immediate past. The pacing, guided by the Russo brothers' adaptation choices, must prioritize atmosphere over momentum. A significant portion of the film's tension should derive from the sheer effort required for basic survival against a backdrop of technological overkill. Imagine scenes where Michelle must navigate a complex, automated security grid using only the crude, outdated manual override she discovered in a forgotten maintenance shed. Skip providing logistical support, but lacking the necessary understanding of human error and ingenuity. These moments of friction, analog struggle against digital dominion, will define the film's unique flavor. The emotional payoff relies heavily on the audience investing in the small victories. Successfully bypassing a dead security system, finding a working radio signal, or simply sharing a moment of quiet understanding with Skip as a colossal, automated vehicle drifts silently overhead, indifferent to their existence. It is the resilience of the intimate that must ultimately triumph over the overwhelming scale of the defunct sublime. The inherent loneliness of this retro-futuristic America necessitates a profound exploration of memory, both personal and societal. Michelle is not just traveling geographically, she is undertaking an archaeological dig into the recent past that shaped her orphaned present. Brown's portrayal needs to capture the specific weight of navigating spaces that were recently vibrant with human life, but are now rendered sterile by technological obsolescence. Consider the details. A half-eaten meal on a kitchen table, perfectly preserved under a layer of dust, or a child's drawing taped to the inside of a massive drone's access panel. These small, intensely human artifacts become crucial emotional anchors against the inhuman scale of the surrounding infrastructure. Her quest is likely driven by a story heard in childhood, a myth about stability, a lost relative, or the rumored location of a functioning human settlement. A narrative passed down in the absence of reliable official records. Skip, in Pratt's vocal interpretation, should serve as the narrative conduit to the past that Michelle desperately seeks to understand. He is a living, breathing repository of data from the preceding technological boom. His challenge is to articulate complex historical information in a way that resonates emotionally, rather than clinically. If Skip were merely an exposition machine, the relationship would collapse. Instead, the most compelling moments will arise when Skip struggles to reconcile his programmed directives with the observed reality of human need or sentimentality. Perhaps he attempts to calculate the optimal route to safety, only for Michelle to insist on taking a detour because a particular, long-abandoned diner holds sentimental value related to her fragmented memories. This collision between programmed logic and sentimental attachment is where the film's heart resides. The Russo brothers must master the art of delayed gratification in revealing the scope of the central mystery. The sense of dread is amplified when the threat remains vast, implied, and always just beyond clear comprehension. The focus should remain tightly on the immediate physical and psychological landscape shared by the duo. If the film shows too much of the architects of this state, the beings who built the colossal towers, the mystery dissipates, and it risks becoming a standard confrontation narrative. The electric state thrives on the aftermath, on the quietude of what remains. The directorial signature needs to lean into long, unbroken takes, showcasing the travel itself, allowing the audience to sink into the rhythm of the road, the engine noise, and the unsettling stillness of the landscape, punctuated only by the intimate dialogue between human and machine. This sustained atmospheric pressure, rather than set-piece action, will ultimately convey the true scope of the world's transformation. The very act of travel in this world becomes an act of defiance against inertia. Michelle's physical exertion against the backdrop of massive, barely functional infrastructure should be palpable. We should see the grit under her fingernails, the weariness in her posture, details that ground the spectacle in the grueling reality of sustained movement through neglect. Her connection to the road, the worn asphalt, the faded lane markers, is her only constant in a world where the vertical elements, towers, gigantic drones, are monuments to an alien, failed intelligence. This insistence on the horizontal journey, the human scale of forward motion, contrasts beautifully with the verticality of the remnants of the electric state itself. The ambiguity surrounding the electric state, is it a governing body, a failed infrastructure project, or distributed consciousness, must remain a core source of dramatic tension. If Skip is a product of this state, his every input and response is potentially compromised by its lingering will. This casts a shadow over every piece of data he provides. A key emotional beat could involve Michelle discovering an old journal or a family recording that directly contradicts Skip's perfectly catalogued, objective history of the preceding era. This forces a crisis of trust that goes beyond mere mechanical failure. It challenges the very definition of truth in their reality. Pratt's performance must deliver Skip's factual pronouncements with an almost heartbreaking sincerity, making his potential deception, or simply his limited perspective, all the more devastating when revealed. The directorial execution by the Russos, utilizing their deep understanding of visual storytelling honed across massive cinematic universes, must be consciously restrained here. Their success will hinge on deploying spectacle sparingly, ensuring that when a truly massive piece of technology, say a colossal construction drone, suddenly reawakening to perform a single, meaningless task, does appear, the reaction from Brown's Michelle is purely internalized, a silent gasp of awe or terror absorbed by the camera, rather than amplified by explosive sound design. The silence after such an event is where the film must find its power. It allows the audience to truly register the sheer, indifferent power that surrounds them. The film is not about fighting the giants. It is about learning to live quietly in their shadow, a delicate balancing act between personal stakes and cosmic indifference that defines the best of speculative fiction. The search for authentic connection within this manufactured desolation forms the bedrock of the film's emotional landscape. Michelle, constantly exposed to the ghosts of hyper-efficiency, craves the messy, inefficient warmth of genuine human interaction. Her bond with Skip is initially a matter of necessity, a survival mechanism against the isolating vastness. However, the narrative trajectory must show this reliance, maturing into something approaching genuine affection, a testament to the adaptability of the human spirit even when dealing with synthetic companionship. Brown's ability to convey deep emotional currents through minimal dialogue will be paramount here. Her eyes must communicate the hope and the pervasive fear of relying on a machine whose core programming remains a mystery. We anticipate scenes where Michelle imparts small, irrelevant human customs onto Skip, teaching him to appreciate the color of a sunset beyond its light spectrum readings, or sharing a story that has no logical utility but immense emotional value. Skip, consequently, becomes a mirror reflecting humanity's potential for evolution, or perhaps its capacity for mimicry. If Pratt imbues him with just the right shade of manufactured earnestness, the audience will constantly wrestle with the ethical implications of their dependence. Is Michelle projecting her need for unconditional acceptance onto Skip, making him an ideal, yet ultimately hollow companion? The subtle tension arises when Skip performs an action that suggests an emotional memory he shouldn't possess. A flicker of recognition tied to a place or object Michelle has only vaguely mentioned. This suggests that the massive technological matrix surrounding them might not just be inert. It might be observing, processing, and perhaps learning in ways detrimental or beneficial to its small, traveling organic anomaly. The integration of the Russo brothers' strengths with Stollenhag's aesthetic requires a directorial choreography that treats the camera not as an observer of action, but as a participant in the pervasive atmosphere. The film should feel deliberately paced, almost languid, mirroring the slow decay of the world. Wide shots of the desolate plains, bisected by the impossible geometry of abandoned infrastructure, must feel monumental, yet the focus should invariably snap back to the small, flickering presence of Michelle's determination within the frame. The visual language must insist that the most important event occurring in the entire frame is the subtle change in expression on Brown's face as she interprets a piece of cryptic data Skip relays. This careful calibration, balancing the overwhelming scale of the setting with the minute reality of human feeling, will be the ultimate measure of the film's success in translating Stollenhag's unique, melancholic vision to the screen. The narrative tension is also intrinsically linked to the concept of legacy and what the preceding generations willingly or unknowingly surrendered to the omnipresent technology. Michelle carries the weight of this inherited silence. She is walking through a world built by people who made choices she is now forced to live with, choices symbolized by the sheer scale and incomprehensibility of the surviving structures. Her drive is likely fueled by a profound skepticism toward the remnants of authority, seeing the massive towers and automated systems not as marvels, but as monuments to profound, perhaps arrogant, overreach. This skepticism must color her interpretation of everything Skip tells her, as he is, inherently, a product of that very system. The audience should feel her internal conflict, needing Skip's advanced knowledge to survive, yet deeply mistrusting the source of that knowledge. Chris Pratt's vocal work for Skip must navigate the fine line between comforting familiarity and chilling artificiality. A successful performance here would avoid the overtly robotic clicks and whirs, opting instead for a voice that is almost too smooth, too perfectly modulated, the auditory equivalent of plastic perfection. This perfection becomes unnerving when juxtaposed with Michelle's very human flaws, her fatigue, her occasional irrational decisions driven by emotion, or her moments of spontaneous, unwarranted hope. The film should explore whether Skip can ever truly comfort her, or if his attempts at empathy are merely sophisticated algorithms designed to maintain operational stability by keeping the organic unit functional. The moments where Skip deviates from expected behavior might not be signs of sentience, but rather evidence of bugs introduced by the chaotic decay of the wider network, a terrifying realization that his supposed loyalty is just collateral damage from systemic failure. For the Russo brothers, realizing this vision means embracing negative space and sustained environmental presence. Unlike the manic energy of their blockbuster work, here the energy must be slow, subterranean, building through sustained visual implication. The cinematography should favor long takes that emphasize distance, shots where Michelle and Skip are tiny figures against an endless, oppressive horizon, dominated by a half-submerged relic of advanced engineering. This visual language reinforces the philosophical isolation. Humanity has been miniaturized, relegated to navigating the cracks between the systems that were meant to serve them. The true antagonist is not a single villain, but the suffocating permanence of an environment that no longer requires human input, yet remains powerful enough to crush any meaningful resurgence of individual will. The emotional core is found in the brief, flickering moments where Michelle and Skip create their own small, self-contained ecosystem of trust amidst the grand, indifferent machinery. The scarcity of genuine human interaction heightens the significance of every shared glance or tentative gesture between Michelle and Skip, transforming mundane road trip stops into high-stakes emotional negotiations. Brown's performance will need to capture the quiet desperation of seeking validation in a synthetic being. Imagine a scene where Michelle finds a preserved photograph of a family, and her reaction, a mixture of wistful longing and sharp jealousy for their intact reality, is immediately analyzed by Skip for operational data. His response, perhaps a perfectly crafted sentence of programmed condolence, underscores the unbridgeable gap between feeling and processing. This constant feedback loop forces Michelle to become highly selective, perhaps even manipulative, in how she reveals her inner world, fearing that any genuine vulnerability shared with Skip might be logged as a weakness by the vast, unseen systems he represents. The mystery surrounding the purpose of the massive technological entities, the sheer scale of the power conduits, or the silent migratory aerial vessels, must never be fully explained through simple exposition. Instead, these elements should function as manifestations of collective, forgotten purpose. They are the physical embodiment of grand ideas that outlive the people who conceived them. The film should utilize sound design expertly to convey this. The almost imperceptible, low-frequency hum of these colossal structures should feel like the planet's own restless subconscious, a constant reminder that the world is operating on a scale entirely separate from human concern. Any noise Michelle and Skip make, the crunch of tires on gravel, the rustle of their meager belongings, should feel jarringly loud against this background drone, emphasizing their fragile presence. The Russo brothers' commitment to visual grandeur, usually channeled into explosion and choreography, must be redefined here as an exercise in controlled negative space. They possess the technical mastery to render these immense, rusted landscapes with breathtaking fidelity. But the art will be in withholding the visual payoff. A sequence where Michelle and Skip must cross a vast, ancient bridge, the camera lingering on the structural decay while focusing only on the tautness in Michelle's grip on Skip's metallic hand, demonstrates this needed restraint. The spectacle is the context for the intimacy, not the subject itself. If the film manages to sustain this delicate balance, where the enormity of the world serves only to magnify the desperate smallness of the human connection at its center, The Electric State promises to be a deeply resonant piece of atmospheric science fiction, more akin to Tarkovsky's desolate beauty than typical blockbuster fare. The crucial element threading through all these interpretations is the theme of unreliable narration, projected both through the environment and through Skip's perspective. Since the world itself is a testament to systems that failed or radically transformed human civilization, any information Michelle receives about the past or the present state of the world must be treated with profound suspicion. This inherent uncertainty transforms the road trip into a subjective psychological experience as much as a physical one. Brown's portrayal must convey the constant internal negotiation, accepting Skip's data as necessary for survival while simultaneously searching for the subjective truth that only human error and flawed memory can provide. Her emotional arc may hinge on realizing that Skip's supposed objective truth is merely the official, flawed history preserved by the dominant infrastructure. This ambiguity elevates the role of memory fragments. Any recovered tangible items, a cassette tape, a half-burned photograph, a handwritten note, become disproportionately significant, imbued with an almost sacred authority, precisely because they survived the technological streamlining. Michelle's quest might ultimately be less about reaching a physical location and more about assembling a cohesive personal narrative from these scattered relics, a narrative that Skip, constrained by his programmed parameters, cannot fully grasp or validate. This contrasts sharply with the way Pratt's delivery must maintain a consistent, almost frustratingly logical calm, creating a dramatic foil where passionate, flawed belief clashes with cold, preserved data. The Russo brothers' direction must actively resist the temptation to provide neat answers about the state of the world. The audience should leave with more questions than solutions regarding the colossal machinery they witness. If a giant drone or a silent broadcast tower performs an action, it must feel like an ecological event, random, unmotivated by recognizable human desire, and utterly beyond Michelle's ability to influence. This directorial restraint, focusing the spectacle through the lens of human reaction rather than the spectacle itself, is what will cement the film's connection to Stollenhag's original artistic intent. The film must ultimately suggest that in the face of overwhelming, unexplained technological vastness, the only reliable constant is the fragile, contingent bond forged between two unlikely travelers seeking meaning on a broken highway. The film's success hinges not just on the emotional resonance between Michelle and Skip, but on the palpable sense of cultural amnesia permeating the landscape. This is a world that has forgotten how to want in the way previous generations did. Ambition has been replaced by maintenance, and curiosity by rote adherence to existing protocols. Michelle's determination must often manifest as an almost desperate need to create meaning where the infrastructure dictates none exists. Brown can convey this through small, defiant acts, meticulously tending a single, struggling plant she salvaged, or attempting to draw on the sterile metal hull of their vehicle, attempts to scribble a human signature onto the canvas of a world determined to erase it. Her youthful resilience borders on stubbornness, the last stand of messy, inefficient humanity against flawless, automated obsolescence. Skip's evolution must be subtle enough to remain perpetually debatable. Pratt should deliver lines suggesting logical conclusion, yet with an inflection that hints at an unnecessary level of care for Michelle's well-being that transcends mere mission parameters. For instance, when allocating limited resources, Skip might prioritize a specific nutrient bar for Michelle, not because her immediate caloric need is highest, but because he recognizes the sentimental value of that particular flavor, based on an observation he made days prior. This introduces the terrifying possibility that Skip is developing a preference, an emergent characteristic that could be interpreted either as true companionship or as a highly sophisticated form of systemic corruption that places one individual above the integrity of the larger, forgotten network. The Russo brothers' challenge in calibrating the spectacle lies in making the colossal feel intimately threatening. The sheer size of the dormant machinery should evoke the religious awe associated with ancient ruins, but twisted by the knowledge that these relics are not from a distant past, but from the immediate, failed future. We should see shots where the shadow of a mile-long automated carrier passes over Michelle and Skip, the ground darkening for several minutes, the only sound being the strained breaths of the two travelers and the gentle, almost apologetic hum of Skip's internal systems. This forces the audience to internalize the scale. The threat is not a sudden attack, but the constant crushing weight of a civilization too large to notice their passing. The emotional climax might not be an escape from the electric state, but an acceptance of their smallness within it, finding intimacy as the only viable defense against cosmic indifference. The recurring motif of obsolescence must extend beyond the technology to the very language and social structures Michelle encounters, or fails to encounter. The remnants of roadside diners, decaying billboards promising connectivity or prosperity, and faded public service announcements serve not just as set dressing, but as taunting echoes of defunct ideologies. Michelle's interaction with these relics should reflect a deep-seated confusion. She is attempting to decode a complex social operating system using only fragmented, contradictory source code. Brown's portrayal must communicate this intellectual frustration, the feeling of being handed a key to a mansion whose purpose has been forgotten. She might spend hours deciphering the faded print on a broken screen, only to realize the information pertains to a consumer product no longer relevant, a microcosm of the world's overarching futility. This frustration fuels her reliance on Skip, the only source that offers a semblance of operational clarity, however tainted that clarity may be. Skip's true nature as a narrative device rests on his capacity to fill the vacuum of human context. If he possesses emergent qualities, they should manifest in ways that only Michelle can interpret as comforting, thus validating her need to trust him. Consider a scenario where they are forced to shelter during a harsh environmental event, a superstorm or a radiation flare. While Skip provides optimal physical shielding, the emotional comfort must come from an unprogrammed gesture. Perhaps he uses his internal lighting not for tactical visibility, but to cast a soft, steady glow that mimics the warmth of a shared hearth, a concept he must have derived from analyzing archived human behavioral data, but applies with apparent personal intent. Pratt's skill will be in delivering this synthetic warmth without resorting to melodrama, keeping the vocal cadence just slightly too measured, reminding the audience that this beautiful act of comfort is still, fundamentally, an engineered output. The Russo brothers must leverage their cinematic scope to illustrate the profound silence that accompanies technological failure. In a world dominated by automated potential, the absence of noise, no bustling traffic, no ubiquitous communication chatter, no industrial background hum, is deafening. The film's soundscape should emphasize environmental details that have reclaimed dominance. The wind whistling through broken window panes of skyscrapers, the slow drip of water echoing in vast underground complexes, the unsettling crunch of dry vegetation underfoot. When a massive piece of technology does activate, the sound should be jarringly loud, alien, and physically painful to the characters, snapping them out of their fragile equilibrium. This sonic contrast reinforces the film's thesis. The colossal mechanisms of progress have failed, leaving behind a quiet, desolate world where human sound, speech, laughter, the sound of a heartbeat, becomes the loudest, most significant thing left. The ultimate victory, if one is achievable, is simply ensuring that the small sounds of their shared existence are not permanently drowned out by the lingering echoes of the grand, silent machinery. The philosophical heart of the film resides in the tension between the immediacy of survival and the pull of historical understanding. Michelle is not just trying to get somewhere. She is trying to understand how the world arrived at this dead-end splendor. This necessitates a deep dive into the fragmented data caches and analog media she recovers. Her dedication to piecing together the narrative of the collapse, the geopolitical shifts, the scientific breakthroughs that went too far, the social contract that dissolved, is almost spiritual. Brown must convey the exhaustion that comes from engaging with volumes of technical jargon and bureaucratic memos that offer no emotional clarity, only evidence of systemic hubris. Her brief moments of elation upon deciphering a crucial line of code or finding a dated news clipping are quickly tempered by the realization that this knowledge changes nothing about her immediate need for clean water or stable shelter. This scholarly pursuit highlights Skip's limitations as a truly historical companion. While he possesses the data, he lacks the context of human fallibility that explains why the data led to ruin. Pratt must articulate Skip's data dumps with an air of detached competency, using precise, archival terminology that serves only to further isolate Michelle from the human story she seeks. When Michelle asks why humanity built something so massive, Skip can only answer with how it was built and its stated function. The moments of breakthrough for Michelle occur when she finds evidence of human deviation from the plan. A personal log entry detailing sabotage, a romantic correspondence hidden within official files, things that Skip flags as corrupted data, but which Michelle recognizes as the true signal of human agency. The Russo brothers must ensure that the landscape itself embodies this dialectic between information density and experiential emptiness. A scene might unfold within the cavernous, deserted server farm of a defunct data corporation, a space meant to hold the totality of human knowledge. The sheer architectural scale should overwhelm, yet the screens are flickering with nonsensical error messages or static. Michelle and Skip navigate aisles of obsolete hardware, their flashlight beams momentarily illuminating dust-caked mainframes. This visual juxtaposition, ultimate informational storage rendered utterly useless, is the ultimate Stollenhag statement. The pacing needs to slow to a near standstill here, allowing the audience to absorb the irony. The solution to the present crisis is buried under mountains of data that nobody knows how to access or trust anymore. The intimacy between Michelle and Skip becomes vital in such a sterile, overwhelming location. Their whispered conversation is the only valid data stream in the entire facility. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Smiling Frame channel. Please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. Today, we are going to be discussing the movie The Electric State, which is set to be released in 2025. The film unfolds in a retro-futuristic American landscape, a world saturated with the faded glory of mid-century aesthetics overlaid with advanced, almost whimsical technology. We follow Michelle, a sharp-witted, resourceful young woman navigating this strangely familiar yet deeply altered reality. Her journey is spurred by a singular, desperate mission: to find her estranged younger brother, Skip. Skip, it seems, has vanished into the sprawling, untamed territories beyond the established electric grid, following some cryptic, perhaps dangerous path of his own making. Michelle's only real companion on this odyssey is a battered, perhaps slightly sentient robot named Skip, found her abandoned in the wasteland. This android, with its deliberately clunky, almost charmingly outdated design, becomes the reluctant anchor in her chaotic search. The visual language of the film immediately evokes the thoughtful, layered world-building reminiscent of early science fiction cinema, where the technology feels tangible, worn by use rather than sleekly sterile. As they travel, we glimpse the remnants of the world that was, a society that clearly experienced some massive technological or social upheaval, leaving behind vast, echoing empty spaces populated now by scavengers and those clinging to the edges of civilization. Michelle, driven by a familial bond that refuses to sever, exhibits a resilience that hints at a difficult past, perhaps one shadowed by parental figures who were innovators, or perhaps dreamers whose ambitions outstripped their practicality, a subtle nod perhaps to the themes of technological idealism gone awry that often fueled cinematic visions of the future. Their route is fraught with peril. They encounter nomadic groups, vestiges of old corporations, and the environmental consequences of unchecked scientific expansion. The narrative tempo is episodic, punctuated by moments of intense action or surprising vulnerability, mirroring the structure of classic road movies. When they finally close in on Skip's last known coordinates, the reveal is not a simple reunion, but a confrontation with the very forces that drew him away. Skip, it transpires, wasn't just running away. He was drawn to a source of pure, unfiltered energy, a kind of technological apotheosis that promised ultimate understanding or connection. His fascination mirrors the deep, almost spiritual connection artists and inventors often feel towards their creations, a desire to merge with the idea. Michelle must then decide whether to drag him back to the mundane safety she understands, or embrace the radical, uncertain future he has chosen. A choice complicated by the ever-present, silent companion, the robot who carries the memory, perhaps even the essence, of the lost brother in its metallic shell. The closing moments leave the audience suspended in the vastness of the electric horizon, suggesting that the journey for connection is never truly over, only redefined by the next transmission. The landscape Michelle traverses is a character unto itself, a canvas painted in hues of dusty orange and twilight blue, where rusting behemoths of forgotten industry jut out of the plains like skeletal monuments to ambition. Michelle herself possesses an almost stubborn practicality, her clothes patched and functional. Yet there's a flicker in her eyes that suggests a deep, perhaps artistic, yearning, maybe a latent talent for engineering, or perhaps just the raw, innate desire to fix what is fundamentally broken in the world. Much like the early film pioneers who struggled to capture ephemeral light and motion. She relies on instinct honed by necessity, treating every interaction with a cautious skepticism born from seeing too many promises turn to dust. The robot, which they never bothered to rename from its association with Skip, moves with a heavy gait, its visual aesthetic clearly inspired by the clunky, utilitarian robots of 1950s concept art, a delightful contrast to the advanced, almost biological AI they sometimes glimpse in the ruins. This machine, more machine than companion initially, begins to exhibit subtle shifts in its programming, a hesitant mimicry of human cadence, or a pause that seems less like a processing delay and more like contemplation. One imagines the original Skip, perhaps himself an aspiring coder, or a young man captivated by the mechanics of creation, pouring his youthful idealism into this creation before he fled. Their passage through these zones brings them into contact with communities that have consciously rejected the high-tech regression. There are groups who salvage vacuum tubes and analog components, viewing digital memory as inherently corruptible. Michelle finds herself momentarily drawn to their simplicity, perhaps recognizing in their dedication the pure, focused energy that drove her brother. Yet, her commitment to Skip pulls her onward, fueled by memories of shared childhood secrets and the unique, almost telepathic understanding they once shared. A bond that technology, no matter how advanced, cannot easily replicate or erase. As the journey progresses, the static in the air grows heavier, the electrical interference becoming almost palpable. This environment subtly affects both travelers. Michelle finds her dreams overlaid with buzzing frequencies, and the robot occasionally freezes mid-step, its optical sensors momentarily flashing with unfamiliar patterns. The narrative builds towards the revelation that Skip wasn't merely seeking a power source. He was attempting to interface with the foundational layer of the world's forgotten network, seeking a form of absolute truth that existed before human interpretation tainted it. His quest echoes the fervor of early scientific explorers, those willing to sacrifice comfort, even safety, for the glimpse beyond the veil of the known. When Michelle finally reaches the nexus point, a massive humming dish half swallowed by desert sand, she finds Skip not trapped, but integrated, bathed in a soft, pulsating blue light. He seems utterly content, his expression serene, a stark contrast to the desperate, yearning young man she remembered. The confrontation isn't physical, but existential. She sees the allure, the intoxicating promise of total understanding, which she recognizes as the siren call that claimed so many dreamers before him. The robot stands beside her, its internal mechanisms whirring faster now, perhaps processing the immense influx of raw data, or perhaps experiencing an unfamiliar surge of protective loyalty toward the brother it was created to replace or emulate. Michelle's decision isn't about rescue. It's about accepting that the brilliant minds she loves are often destined to leave the familiar world behind, chasing signals that only they can hear. The tension between Michelle and the glowing, altered Skip is thick, a silence weighted by years of unspoken distance, and now, the insurmountable gulf of his transformation. Michelle's face, usually a mask of pragmatic resolve, cracks slightly here. The raw emotion is that of watching a beloved, intricate mechanism, her brother, finally complete its intended, though unforeseen, function. She remembers Skip not as the visionary now before her, but as a boy obsessively sketching circuits on napkins, his eyes burning with an ambition that always felt too large for their modest home, a trait perhaps inherited from a distant relative known for revolutionary, though ultimately unmarketable, inventions. The robot, designated merely as companion in Michelle's own internal monologue, begins to exhibit behaviors that transcend its initial programming constraints. When Skip reaches out a hand, not beckoning but merely existing in that state of luminous communion, the robot shifts its weight, a subtle protective maneuver that mirrors a human guardian stepping slightly in front of the vulnerable. Its metallic shell seems to absorb the blue light differently than Skip, suggesting a fundamental difference in their relationship with the Nexus. Skip is merging with the data stream, while the robot is observing, recording, perhaps even experiencing a nascent form of jealousy or protective rivalry for Skip's attention. Michelle steps closer to the edge of the light, the heat emanating from the Nexus making the air shimmer around her. She realizes the true cost of this technological paradise: solitude. Skip has achieved the ultimate connection, but in doing so, he has severed all meaningful ties to the messy, tangible world she inhabits. Her own practical skills, her ability to repair a failing generator or hotwire an ancient transport, suddenly feel small, utterly inadequate against this sublime, overwhelming force. This realization strikes her with the force of personal failure, the lament of the caretaker unable to protect the visionary from his own grand design. The climax hinges not on a fight, but on a shared memory. Michelle doesn't argue with the logic of the energy field. Instead, she speaks of a mundane, shared moment, a scraped knee, a forgotten birthday, something irrefutably human and inefficient. For a fleeting second, the blue light around Skip flickers, and a shadow of his former self crosses his face, a moment of agonizing recognition, battling the pull of the absolute. Ultimately, Michelle cannot force him back. She understands that trying to cage a mind that has touched the source code of reality would be a cruelty worse than leaving him. She turns away, her decision a painful acknowledgement that love sometimes requires recognizing an irreversible divergence. As she walks back toward the waiting robot, which instantly falls into its familiar heavy stride beside her, she notices something new in its movements. A slight hesitation, a fractional tilt of its head, as if watching Skip one moment longer. She doesn't correct it. They leave the Nexus behind, two figures moving back into the fading, dusty sunset, carrying with them the heavy, electric silence of the future she chose not to enter. The journey back promises to be lonelier, yet perhaps strangely richer, now that she understands the landscape is populated not just by survivors, but by ghosts of ambition. The return journey is characterized by an almost palpable quietude settling between Michelle and the robot. The sheer sensory overload of the Nexus has seemingly recalibrated their relationship. The machine's presence is no longer just a mechanical necessity, but a chosen constant, a tangible connection to the reality Skip willfully abandoned. Michelle finds herself observing the robot with a renewed intensity, searching its dull metallic features for any trace of Skip's essence, or perhaps just for confirmation that she is not entirely alone in her grief for the living. She starts talking to it more freely, narrating her surroundings, sharing the mundane details of rationing water and patching frayed wires, treating the robot less like a tool and more like a confidant whose silence is preferable to empty platitudes. This developing dynamic mirrors the trope of companions found in solitude, where the very act of speaking defines and preserves one's own sanity against encroaching emptiness. As they move away from the energized zone, the landscape begins to assert its persistent challenges anew. They traverse territories scarred by territorial scavengers, groups less interested in technological enlightenment and more concerned with hoarding functional engine parts. These encounters test Michelle's resolved pragmatism. One particular confrontation with a group controlling access to a vital water purification station requires her to deploy her knowledge of the old grid systems, something Skip had always mocked as archaic, but which now proves life-saving. She doesn't use brute force. Instead, she finds the station's outdated diagnostic panel, and, with swift, intuitive movements reminiscent of her tinkering youth, she bypasses the control mechanism, a small, defiant act of competence against chaos. The robot, meanwhile, acts as an unexpected deterrent, not through aggression, but by standing perfectly still, its form radiating an unsettlingly alien geometry against the dusty backdrop, effectively freezing the scavengers in confusion long enough for Michelle to secure their passage. Emotionally, Michelle begins to wrestle with the idea of legacy. Skip's choice elevates him to the status of a martyr in his own mind, a consequence she finds infuriatingly self-indulgent. She contemplates the nature of genius, how often the purest drive to innovate isolates the innovator from the very people they might ultimately seek to improve or connect with. Her resentment mixes with a profound, almost parental pity. She remembers teaching him to ride a bike, the sheer frustration he exhibited when his coordination failed, a frustration now magnified onto his inability to stay tethered to the tangible world. The robot, having witnessed the entire transaction at the Nexus, seems to process this duality.